Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast. If you are watching on the YouTube or Rumble platform, you'll notice that we have a returning guest, actually a quick turnaround. Mr. Iain Harrison is back, and today's subject is Ukraine. Now, for those who are just tuning in now, would you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, I'm the editor-in-chief of RECOIL magazine, and I've recently returned from Ukraine because I felt that the US media was not doing a particularly good job, and therefore, if you want to see something for yourself, then there's only one way to do it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And so we were talking about the show. We talked a little bit more about your background the last time we had you on just a week ago. And that point of note is that you spent some time in where you acquired your accent military and then left that, came to the United States. And so I want to be able to draw a little bit on that experience as we're having this conversation. But starting with, yes, I think that's a really good point to start with when it comes to the war in Ukraine, is that it's oftentimes described as a war of information, but that even by saying that, describing this conflict as an information battle, I don't think it's very sufficient. And so how would you describe that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think this is the first time we've seen war played out in real time via the means of social media, and as a result of it, I think both all parties involved are learning very quickly and learning on their feet, because prior to this was not really a template for the information warfare that is coming out of this right now. So it's very difficult, and it's been purposely made very difficult, I think, in order to figure out exactly what's going on. Because each of the interested parties, has a very significant interest in promoting their own worldview.
Very much so. There's differences in some ways. It could be the East versus West, and then also two very large structures of power conflicting with each other in one area. So that information you said, it's the first time we're seeing it in real time, and that's technology, right? So we're over a year into, Russia is over a year into what is being referred to as its invasion, but this has been going on for a lot longer than a year.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, you can look at the Russian influence in Ukraine and really trace it back all the way back to 1991. After Ukraine gained its independence, and then in order for that to happen, they had to give up their nuclear weapons, which kind of were part of the Soviet Union anyway. But in order to do that, in order to secure their nationhood, they surrendered their nuclear weapons, and then in order to gain assurances of security from the Western powers. And then once that happened, Russia then went in and said, well, we want you back, and then took every step they could in order to make sure that happened. Starting off with soft power, and then getting progressively further down the road of subverting Ukrainian civil society.
Yeah, so was this what we would refer to as like shadow conflicts, or like, it's not, this is still pre-proxy war, but you're seeing influence campaigns being very, very, very like very directed or very targeted towards the Ukrainian people, where Russia is trying to change the Overton window within the population as to what they consider politically acceptable, and then also gain, I guess I would think, gain like not just an ideological footholds, but like a population level foothold enough where the idea of rejoining or having Ukraine join into Russia doesn't seem like that drastic of a step. Like for example, like if Mexico were to join into the United States, that would be a very unusual or very large change because of the cultural differences, the language speaking, the cultural differences, as well as the language barrier. But if you could even break down the language barrier and say in 20 years have Mexico all speak only English, then the Mexico folding into the United States would be much less unusual looking. So when it comes to those influence campaigns, though, Russia isn't the only one trying to influence the Ukrainian people. Is that fair to say? That's an accusation that's kind of made?
Yes, to a great extent. Yeah, there obviously have been some attempts by Western nations in order to influence Ukrainian politics also, just the way of the world. However, the Russian attempts have been, I would say, up until 2014, more successful. Had been more successful.
Okay.
And starting with pretty much a wholesale level of corruption of politicians. And there was a lot of that happening in the 10 years after 1991. Russia succeeded in corrupting a bunch of politicians throughout the Ukrainian body politic. And as a result of that, they figured that the 2014 invasion of the Donbass would go a lot easier. Well, it did go pretty easy, but as a result of that corruption, for example, when the little green men started appearing, the Russian forces, which were showing up as supposedly separatists, they're actually Russian troops without insignia. When that happened, the Ukrainians were able to field about 6,000 troops to go and counter that, out of an army that should have been in the hundreds of thousands. But the reason they weren't able to do that was pretty much the rot from within.
Okay, so we're gonna make. I think we can make we have a need for a definition, not because I think it's a hard thing to define, but I think it just gets used a little bit. Like when you're talking about corruption here, we're just talking about giving you money in exchange for favors. You're talking about Russian government or Russian influence campaigns buying the vote or participation of Ukrainian officials.
Yes, to a great extent, and plus there was already in the East, especially, they had a favorable view of Russia as a nation state, and some of that was driven by economics, just the economics of people moving out of the area, working abroad, and then coming back. For example, how big Ukraine is, and how underdeveloped their internal infrastructure is. So generally, people on the East, after the wall fell, if they wanted to work abroad, they'd go to Russia, whereas people in the western part of the country would cross over to Europe. And so consequently, you see cross-pollination of those influences and those ideas coming back from those particular markets.
Yeah, so on an ideological level, we see a big conflict between East and West, but at the same time, the world is getting smaller where we can communicate more with people across the world. So it's not so much like those people look different than my people. It's that we have different goals and those goals conflict. Well, there are different series of goals and objectives and values that people have that are now in conflict, and that's seems to be the place where it lands. Can we make a series of distinctions? Because the thing that you said that piqued the interest was how there's a bit of a criticism common in news that there is this kind of right wing, not right wing, but common in the right is a bit right in American media. This is a descriptor, not a prescriptor. It's common. There's a common was it bubble, or there's a commonly held series of views within right-wing media in America today that is does not look favorably on the war, and they don't look favorably on it because of a number of reasons. One of them is that they don't see that America should be involved or is involved in any way, in any valuable way, or that involvement of America in the war is in what Ukraine is engaging with, or the West supporting Ukraine is egging on a World War III scenario. I see, a number of different things from like even cultural references. And I think it'd be a stretch to say that the right is like pro-Russian, but they're certainly, at least to give them the most generous description, skeptical about this conflict. And so then you criticize that, and it criticized not just that, as in like, well, there's the zeitgeist. It was like there's more going on here, and you referred to a two-front war. That we don't want to, the America or the West does not want to get into a situation where it's in a two-front conflict between Russia, China, and the United States. Since we've had that conversation, apparently Putin and Xi Jinping have had conversations, and I'm sure they've been talking before. But what is the framework by which you were making that statement? How can you kind of build on that a little bit more? So
yeah, absolutely. And it's been interesting to see the progression of thought process, particularly on it and during the last 12 months, particularly in right-wing media. And you kind of get the impression that part of it is driven purely by tribalism. And if the current administration is in favor of something, then we have to be against it. Part of it is driven by the natural tendency of American isolationism, which is perfectly valid. And then you have sort of political opportunists and grifters who seem to think that they can carve out a little bit of a niche audience by being contrarian. Again, all these are perfectly valid points and perfectly valid ways of creating an audience or catering to an audience. But there's also, I guess, a little bit of cynicism involved in seeing this develop. Like I had back in November, I had a really good conversation with a CIA PSYOPs analyst, and she confidently predicted exactly what we see today. And I was a little bit dubious that what she predicted would come to pass, but sure enough, it has. And you get the likes of out and out grifters like Tucker Carlson just pandering to people and telling them whatever they want to hear.
All right, so the let's go back to the analyst's prediction. So when we're talking again PSYOP, there's a number of terms that get used quite a bit, especially in this layer. This sort of gun. I want to try to draw a square, and that framework being politics. On one wall you have kind of a political influence, on the other one you have a military influence. This is still like the Ukrainian circle. Then you also have gun culture and just there's a third or fourth wall that I have to, maybe it's news, maybe it's media, maybe it's the internet, maybe it's pseudo-intellectualism, maybe it's intellectual approach. But the the term PSYOPs, intel, threat matrix, this sort of area of communication and interest that ranges from overt military action to like insurgency interest. I mean, I've got a couple books on my shelf. The term PSYOPs can mean a lot of different things, and it's similar to the issue of like what we refer to as like fifth generation warfare, or similar to what we refer to as like just war theory. Is like these are terms that we use. I want to make sure that we have a chance to iron them out a little bit. So the PSYOPs analyst is making a prediction of what will come to pass. What were some of those predictions, and how does that relate to PSYOPs at all?
Well, her job is to get ahead of information ops that are launched by other countries, other national interests, or non-state actors. And so consequently, you gamed out what could conceivably happen with regards to Russian information ops, and also, say, a willing audience or an eager audience in the US. And I'm not saying that people who have that opinion are naturally skeptical of US involvement in the Ukraine war, which they should be, are being overtly and only shaped by Russian information operations. But however, it is a factor. It's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like kind of like an insurgency works, the difficulty of the counterinsurgent, or one of the objectives and challenges of the counterinsurgent, is to isolate the insurgents from the population. Correct. This is like, and this is so I think in the effort of like describing a problem, say a captured audience that is already kind of eager to accept a certain amount of information, that describing something like that is sort of trying to understand how the mechanism works. That's how I'm reading it. Instead of it just
Absolutely.
being,
Yeah, I would
instead of it
actually
just being
understand.
like an overt moral condemnation or whatever. Because even like Tucker Carlson as an individual, every time I hear this in the modern world, it makes me cringe a little bit of like, oh, I don't like everything that he says, but he said this. It's like, the reason why I find it kind of cringe inducing is because I don't I don't know of anyone who I would see this way or who sees the world in such a way where I believe everything that person says, whether it comes to Jordan Peterson, Tucker Carlson, Cenk Uygur, Tim Pool, my professors at the college, my father, my friends. None of us want blind acceptance, even from our allies or other people, I suppose. And I mean, if you engage in the blind acceptance level of like, well, he said it, therefore it's true, the authoritarian fallacy, then we're probably not having the same conversation.
Mm.
So
With one exception, when I become emperor of the universe, then obviously that's what I'm going to demand.
did you say the universe? The universe.
Think big, dude.
Does the limit of human conception affect the universe?
No, well,
Are you
not for me.
Not for you, not for you. Okay. Well, so a point that I'll say in this one, right, is like there's a political character that comes up from time to time, and that's Malcolm Nance. And I've read some of his books too, and I've read one of his books, and I have mostly nothing but criticism for him, but there's something to be, and so the point that I'm saying with that one is that the issue that I have with some of his stuff is that he's ascribing moral values to people who he has no care in the world about, no knowledge about whatsoever. I think he's a little bit more of a saboteur. And I don't know if I would. I think he acts more like a political saboteur than anything else. Like he's the kind of guy that you want to put on your television show when you want to burn an olive branch between two people. He's guaranteed to make it not work. And I'll remember why I brought him up again, because eventually I'll have to, because he's kind of, but so we can go back to this situation that we're talking about. Like, so your criticism of the media presentation, especially right-wing media presentation, is that it doesn't seem to be, it doesn't from the outside in appear to be introspective of its pre-existing biases. It's a little too willing to go down a road, and it needs to check those. Is that how you're kind of bringing it up, or is it that they're just misplaced?
No, I think that's fair enough. I think it's a fair point.
Okay.
I think also there's a degree of opportunistic, just the opportunism that to exploit something that where people have a little bit of justifiable unease about, and then presenting an alternate view that caters to that without reference to fact.
Okay. Okay, so without a reference to, okay, so yeah, the weakness being it's kind of prying on a like a built-in bias of sorts. Let's so then what would be, so
and we all have that.
Oh, for sure,
We
right?
all
And
have
we do. It's the work of the individual to try to work through it to the best ability that you can. We're not perfect, but we should try, right? So there is a framework, and let's try to draw me what your framework of the Ukrainian conflict is. Like, how do you look at it from the 30,000 foot view down to the level of the individual?
I'd probably start with the individual level, because
All right.
that's easiest. And so when this all kicked off, again, I was kind of first of all intrigued by it, and second of all, I had already a pre-existing frame of reference because I actually worked with Ukrainian troops in the mid-90s in the Balkans conflict, and was singularly unimpressed when I did so. In fact, they were a complete shit show, and with quite quite stunning levels of corruption within their command. And so when I first went over there this last year, I was quite willing to be utterly underwhelmed, and went into that with that frame of mind. Bear in mind that the mid 90s was only like 3, 4, 5 years after Ukrainian independence, and therefore the society was very much modeled on the Soviet one. So that probably colored my thinking. But again, as personal experience based in the field, not particularly impressed at all. So fast forward, and I offer that purely just as local color, as just a way of characterizing my mindset going into it. So from the 30,000 feet level, we in the West, though certainly the Western intelligence agencies, were aware of Russia's intentions since June of 2022. 21. And the amount of evidence that was coming out of that area based on human intelligence, SIGINT, aerial reconnaissance, all indicated that this was not going to be purely saber rattling. This is not just going to be a set of military exercises. This is actually going to be a full-on invasion. So with that said, since June of 2021, this current administration had enough, and it's not often you get that, but it had enough forethought and forewarning in order to come up with a plan to put into effect in the case of it actually come to fruition, the Russian invasion. So, there's a lot about this administration I don't particularly like, particularly when it comes to individual rights and firearms. But it does appear that in this instance, they haven't fucked it up quite as badly as they could have.
Okay. Yeah. So the way that criticisms and questions are framed also has a lot to do with it, and one of them being we had a rather catastrophic end to the Afghan campaign, which from my level of analysis is that on no meaningful leadership level did we establish or set a goal and then work towards a means of accomplishing it. Therefore, you get the forever wars concept, the American corruption of people making money off of war. You get the warmongering issue, and so with the collapse of Afghanistan, so quickly precipitating the launch of the war in Ukraine, not that America's directly involved in the same in any of the same capacities. Looking back, it kind of looks like we traded one conflict for another. We're like, oh well, and so if that was the case, if America was American, let's just say the American intel world was able to, or decision makers were able to know that Russia was probably going to invade with some sort of reasonable certainty. Do you think
how did this screw the Afghanistan exit up so badly?
Do you think that's why? Do you think that had any influence over, like, oh hey, we got a bigger problem around the corner, we're just going to leave?
I don't think so. I think the White House drove the exit decision, and the White House drove the timeline. Mm-hmm. And when everything fell apart, then they were quick to ascribe blame to anywhere other than the White House.
Oh, for sure. Okay, so that clears that up. Then the second part, though, and I was thinking about this way, is that one of the challenges that we had dealing with when I was in Afghanistan is that we worked with the locals quite a bit, even not even to the capacity that we were at. And one thing that was continuously frustrating about our Afghanistan was sort of the unwillingness of the unwillingness or undisciplined nature of the unwillingness or undisciplined cultural history of the people that we were working with. It's like there were large portions of the Afghan population, maybe not even large, but there were a disproportionate amount of people that seemed rather disinterested in the well-being of their own country. They were much either tribally focused or with other conflicts that were not easily translated into the West. And the American population by this time had no real interest or paid attention to what was going on, which is kind of fine, to be honest. So we did see, though, a switch. Is that the one major difference between Afghanistan and Ukraine is that the Ukrainian people were the opposite of the Afghans. They were very nationalistic,
very much so,
or at least patriotic of some sort. It's like they believed in their country. They were willing to make sacrifices to make the whole thing work. And so I wonder if that had any influence over the mid-level leadership that has played a role.
Yeah, I think we've seen for the last 20 odd years or so that America has played a big role in supporting countries that really didn't care about themselves, or at least their populations were, as you said, completely unmotivated in order to either improve their lot or improve the outcome of the situation for their own country. As you said, Ukraine is completely opposite to that. They're, if anything, I've seen more ultra nationalists there than anywhere else that I've encountered in my travels. To that end, I mean, ultra nationalism can have its own set of baggage, drawbacks, whatever you want.
Moral pitfalls.
Moral pitfalls. I think that's a good way of putting it. My country, right or wrong. But yeah, the stark contrast between the two cultures couldn't be more distinct.
Yeah, I that part has been interesting to me of seeing it as the attitude that the West has approached Ukraine is very different than the attitude that the West approached Afghanistan. And in some ways, on a sort of societal pundit level, I think a lot of the West approached Afghanistan in exactly the way that they would condemn. And that is sort of as like a colonizing atmosphere. Like, and I mean this in like the newscaster level. I don't mean this in like the soldier. I don't think the government was like, we're going to go colonize Afghanistan. I think that
good luck with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been there quite a bit, and to be honest, I like the food still. So there's that. So on a now going just back to Ukraine as a conflict, the timeline in 21 where the elements of the American intel sphere is rather confident that Russia's going to invade. And then they do, and that's one thing to be evaluated on. We're also looking at, I think we could even kind of circle into the goal of, or how you're evaluating the Russian invasion of Ukraine from like different, not perspectives, but different qualifiers, like the moral application of it, the capabilities wise, why is it going this way, why is it not going that way, concerns for the future, and what's going on. Because it's one thing to say that this could lead to World War III. It's another one completely to say World War III is basically inevitable. We're just picking how it's going to start.
Yeah. I don't see this one leading to World War III. I think World War III, if it ever happens, is going to be way further east than that. But taking a player off the chessboard that could play a major part in World War III and taking a player off the chessboard without endangering American troops, I think is a major factor here.
Mm-hmm. So coming from having more experience in more government capable, or like military, right? European military, Cold War. I obviously wasn't in Eastern Europe in the 90s.
Yeah, I'm that old.
Yeah, well, I'm not. So there, I'm trying to figure that stuff out. But what is like? How would you translate like the echoes of the Cold War to anyone who's listening? Because that, for me, it might as well be fictional outside of a history book. It's kind of an aesthetic.
Yeah, it's an aesthetic that you still see all over Eastern Europe.
Mm.
The Soviet tradition of "fuck you" architecture is still very strong.
I don't
That's
I I don't think the Soviet architecture communicates "fuck you." That's way too punk. It's "I will fuck you. I'm the government."
yeah, I think we're talking the same language.
Okay,
Like,
cool.
yeah, you like you are a unit of production, and you will live there.
Hmm. Yes, that is the only appropriate answer. You are a
Yeah.
unit of production, and you will live there. Exactly. So then, so the conflict between the East and the West when it came to the Cold War is that first nuclear conflict where we're not using nukes against each other, but this is where we get terms like arms race and we get conflicts like that. And
Yep. Yep.
so while there's a lot of there's a lot of talk about Ukraine being the catalyst for a World War III or a nuclear war or a hot nuclear war with Russia, why do you not see that as a why are you against that as like a normal thing? Why is that not your concern? Because nukes are a hard thing for us to consider. Like the very idea of this entire city just being gone because or burnt, irradiated is kind of foreign to most Americans outside of fiction.
Mhm. Um, well, Soviet doctrine. I think. Well, Soviet doctrine aside, because we will fast forward through that because we're no longer in that era, we're in post-Soviet era. Russia, obviously having the world's largest nuclear arsenal, I think still is not going to be in a position to use them, or will not. There are sufficient people inside the government that would throw up roadblocks to any use of nuclear weapons outside of a existential threat to the country. And to my knowledge, nobody's talking about extending the parameters of this conflict over across the border out of Ukraine and into Russia. So I think there's going to be. Well, we've seen a lot more. There's going to be more, and we've seen prior to this a lot of nuclear saber rattling. But I think it's only saber rattling, and until you get down to that existential threat level, I really can't see it happening. This is existential threat to the nation state versus existential threat to the current government.
Okay.
And particularly one or two members of that government.
Okay, so you're describing a difference between the Ukraine war being an existential threat to Russia or a couple of people within its leadership that could be changed over, could leave office, and much of this would change. Well, I've heard reports of Ukraine or Ukraine adjacent military force being used on Russian soil, like a strategic depot being destroyed, or maybe a technological conflict, like a cyber attack or a bridge or whatever. And how does that play into this perspective? Because it's not so much an if true, how would that affect your position at all?
Yeah, there have been a couple of cross-border raids so far, but honestly, they've been minor and they've been mainly propaganda victories rather than actually strategic victories, with the exception of the Kerch Bridge. And that area is regarded as part of Ukraine anyway. So they're just simply trying to get back the property that they lost during 2014.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't see that being escalatory. It's simply operations that are coming in, being played out inside of Ukrainian territory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Ukraine. This is another issue this is another issue to the existential crisis. That if it would be considered, if Russia could establish a very clean cut description of why a conflict of this nature was an existential crisis to them, then I think it would add another layer of moral conflict to the table. I think that in order for them to do so might be a bit of a stretch, but I think it may not. I'm saying I don't think it even. I don't know if it would justify the conflict at all, but it would definitely add a little bit more flavor to the pot. And one of the ways that it's been described in the past, I've heard it described in the past, or I've even thought of, is that, like, well, this is not my idea, but we've heard it described. If NATO has not exactly been. NATO was in some sense created to be a stop, like a prison, a intellectual prison for Russia. NATO was created to stop the Russian threat. This is, of course, back at when the global threat of communism was much more overt. We're also looking at, post World War II kind of America, the West. So I can understand how time would change, generations change. We're like 3 generations away from when even this started. And and so NATO, though, does not seem to have a good track record of doing what it says it's going to do in regards to moving closer and encroaching on Russia, which on the one hand comes across as a little dishonest. Like, a negotiation between the two doesn't work out very well when one party or both parties are dishonest. However, that also doesn't override the fact that you're talking about world powers here. This isn't just the fact of being a world power in a conflict could make that conflict necessarily existential, because is there any negotiating out of it?
Well, I think with regards to the expansion of NATO, I think NATO is not this all-consuming Borg-like organization. The countries petition to be part of NATO, they have that ability as self-determining nation states in order to decide whether or not they wish to be part of that larger organization, and to ascribe a moral equivalency between NATO and Russia, I think, misses the point entirely. And as far as NATO being an organization which is encroaching up against the Russian borders, well, yeah, NATO was created in order, as you say, in order to provide a counterweight to the Soviet Union. And it is an entirely defensive organization. It has never deployed troops to invade another country. Individual states within, obviously, America has, but NATO as an organization has not. Russia, on the other hand, has, since 1991, deployed its troops across its borders, outside of its borders, 9 times.
Mm-hmm. So from a framing, this is, again, going back to a framing way of thinking about it, and part of that, trying to understand more than what I know, and this being describing NATO can describe itself as a defensive counterweight to the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union isn't around anymore, and that I think there's a sort of, how do I say it? Not disingenuous. I mean, America's relationship with the UN and NATO is kind of weird, like the blue helmets and the goofy stuff like that. But my point being said is, the NATO can afford to say that it's a defensive only structure or organization because some of its members are the most powerful militaries on the in the world, and also use them offensively. So would that? I think what I'm looking at here is that there's this way that NATO wants to present itself, and we should just kind of get rid of that and go back to drawing what that table looks like, because the NATO framework of us being NATO being a defensive structure comes across a bit disingenuous when its members are not, when its members are deploying troops around the world. So this isn't to give Russia a moral point. It's just to say I think that negotiation is not working anymore at all. And if we're going to be direct with Russia in that sense, and if NATO is going to be direct with Russia in response to a conflict involving Ukraine, I feel like it would be considered more authentic even if it was a little bit more forceful, and not in that weird kind of petty tyrant way. I don't know. I'm having a hard time seeing NATO as a defensive structure right now.
Purely because some of its members employ troops outside their own borders, or have done. Well, I think it's kind of analogous to, you're a member of a social club, and the club's bylaws dictate that you, when you're representing the club, can't walk around, run down the street with your pants on your head naked. But you do that on your spare time anyway. But as far as the outlook and the rules of the club goes, the rest of the members of the club aren't going to show up on your doorstep with their pants on their head.
Fair. It's an accept. I mean, yeah, it's we're not selling our national sovereignty by being part of NATO. Absolutely. Right. And that is a very distinct and important element. So, then, okay, that does help clear it up a bit. How does that change? Because let's go back to even what we started at, or does it change at all? How would we look at it then as a war of information, or an information war from the beginning, in regards to even nation states and the country? If what does a non-military act of aggression look like?
Good question. Non-military act of aggression. What that we've seen so far coming out of this conflict?
Well, you could I think you could say that influence campaigns, influence peddling from Russia corrupting the Ukrainian people would be a form of they're not necessarily attacking the Ukrainian people, but they are indirectly affecting the Ukrainian people by buying their government. That would be a criticism, but you could and that is a criticism that could be leveled at multiple people. We level at our own politicians when they accept money from countries like China. So it may not be an act of aggression in the sense of I'm building, I'm hitting your borders with bombs.
No, but it's another way of achieving policy goals.
Or another example would be, I was talking to a man who works with the economics of the cartel-oriented drug trade, and he said one of the things that he was talking about was how the economic impact of fentanyl costs the manufacturer $300, but they're making about $25 million in profit. And on top of that, there's whatever it's costing the American population in lives, in labor, in investigations, in medical, in surgery, in all of these, politics, newsletters, whatever. And so what you're saying is that you've got a $300 bomb, metaphorical bomb, that is the precursor chemicals are purchased from China or acquired from China. The precursor chemicals being sort of I can buy fertilizer. That doesn't mean I'm going to make explosives out of it. But the precursor chemicals are acquired from China to make fentanyl, which is brought to the United States, and that's seen as a form of economic warfare. It's causing a major economic crippling factor on the United States, but it costs you nothing, and then you have plausible deniability. So similar things could be said to Russia, or is that? Because I see that as we're looking at new forms of conflict. We're going to have to figure out how to evaluate it. And if we don't, well, then we're not going to be a world power for very long.
Well, I think in terms of the buying influence like that, you can see what happened in Germany, particularly with the Merkel administration.
Elaborate, please.
So Germany during Angela Merkel's tenure decided that due to green pressures that they were going to mothball all their nuclear plants, turn away from coal, of which Germany has substantial reserves for power generation, and focus on wind and solar, and focus on wind and solar in a country where the wind doesn't blow that much and is not particularly reliable and is generally overcast and cloudy. So well done, Germany, well done. Unfortunately, despite their best intentions, they ran up against a little thing called reality, and in order to bridge that gap between the power that was able to be generated by green sources and the actual demand that was required by German industry and their population, they turned to Russian natural gas in order to have those BTUs. And the Russians were quite happy to sell them that and produced, ran a couple of pipelines into the country, or multiple pipelines into the country, because once you're beholden to somebody for your energy sources, then it's very easy to have influence over their policy decisions. And we saw that come to fruition, particularly over the last year or so. And Germany now is weaning themselves off Russian natural gas at a prodigious rate and having to pay something like 5 or 6 times the market value of what they were paying for before.
Before they're paying 4 to 5 or 5 to 6 times what they're paying before they transition to being so heavily dependent on Russian natural gas, or now that they're trying to get out.
Now that spigot is being turned off, they're having to import LNG from the US.
Okay, that's right. So this is the economic impact. Well, I mean, it would make sense for I can understand why a country like Russia would see that choice by that choice by Germany to be favorable for them. Like, okay, they're going to become they're going to become near permanent monopolized customers, then why should we say no? I guess. Of course, now Germany's trying something otherwise. Germany wouldn't be able to make that decision, though, if they didn't have allies in other countries.
Germany might not have made that decision had not the decision makers been bought off.
So there's an influence. I'm seeing a goofy parallel here, but the right is oftentimes accused of being pro-Russian. But it seems like the green, the green, whatever you want to call it, like the environmentalists in Germany, which environmentalism usually likes to say that it's left wing, was bought by Russians in this perspective.
Big time. There's big time Russian influence operations inside the green movement in Germany.
In Germany, okay. Do you have any evidence or reason to believe that it extends outside of Germany?
That would be me speculating.
Okay.
But I would like to, stay away from speculation if possible.
I can definitely I can appreciate that. Yeah, because that would be, yeah. All right, cool. So, yeah, that's probably a wise choice. So, how about, so are you, we were talking about this briefly, but there's the difference between jus ad bello and jus in bello and jus ad bellum. Of like, this goes back to like just war theory. Saint Augustine of Hippo, if you want, is a character who I've read some of his work before. He's seen as the father of just war theory. I think one of the challenges that I've seen when it comes to conversation and the information conflict about Ukraine and Russia, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that the arguments are very rarely parsable for anything useful other than just emotive moral condemnations of this or that. And this could be easily as said as Biden's going to put us into World War III. I've made the statement that his son is no Franz Ferdinand, or the Ukrainian people are suffering. Putin's an evil dictator, and it's like, well, I don't know if I would consider you a good judge of character, but how the difference between jus in bello and jus ad bellum, both Latin, refer to justification for war, the appropriate criteria, which would be jus ad bellum, What are the appropriate criteria in order for a war to be justified? And then jus in bello is how does one act morally while in a conflict? And those two are, it's a kind of important distinction that's drawn from that element of Christian history. And so how then for people like you and I who are not in the military, I don't have the same skin in the game per se, even though both you and I have traveled to Ukraine to see some of it with our own eyes. How has your perspective developed in the last year?
That's an interesting question. I think in terms of development wise, I mean, there's still that bedrock of Russia did invade. There is no question about that. I mean, despite the fact that they're now trying to reframe it and saying that Ukrainian troops crossed the border and invaded Russia, this simply didn't happen. And so from that perspective, I think Ukraine has every right in order to defend their borders and restore their boundaries. As far as individual performance, individual actions within the war, I think while I was there last time, there was pretty much never a day when the missile warnings weren't going off and the indirect fire was landing in civilian areas. So in terms of prosecuting a war, whereas we've come out of the last 20 years trying to minimize civilian casualties and be the good guys and taking every step we could in order to do that. If for no other reason than there's the information war aspect of that, and you don't want to be painted with that brush. That's not been the case in my experience.
So it's caught a bunch of attention from the beginning, but the invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has caused a bit of an inverse exodus where a lot of people from across the world have been flooding to Ukraine for different reasons. Many of those reasons are less than admirable. Let's put it that way. And there's a lot of attention on it, right? So you're getting news media characters. This goes back to Malcolm Nance. You're getting our veterans there to support the war. Like there for the first time. I think this is a war. This is a war that's a first in two fronts, and on the one front is that a lot of it is being so televised. It is being so reported in real time. People are there. There's a camera in everybody's hand, partially because of cell phones, partially because of attention to it. The second part of it, though, is that it's drawn a lot of people there. Some of them for fame, some of them for glory, some of them for money, some of them for much less morally questionable reasons, like the defense of the Ukrainian people. And that is a reality that I think is very hard to communicate to many people. That you can go to a war zone where you'll have two people. One's a war profiteer and the other one's doing charity, and it turns out that the war profiteer is the actual moral one. For some reason, he's just running a business, whereas the other guy is, running maybe not doing the charity right or something. And so, how much have you seen coming from volunteers? It's like Ukraine is being defended by people who are just volunteering to go to war.
Yeah, and it's not only international people who are going, and not foreigners who are going in there and volunteering. They have a large volunteer population inside their own borders that are to some extent doing their own thing. And I was quite surprised the last time I was there just to see that. And I was thrown into it because I went over there to deliver some humanitarian aid. Because I think if you do have the ability to improve somebody else's quality of life in that situation, then I think you have a moral obligation to do so. And so took a consignment of a humanitarian aid in, and on the way, and again, just to speak to your point of people arriving with different motivations and different moral compasses. When I was in Heathrow waiting for the flight to Poland, there was a young kid there, maybe 18 years old, if that, dressed in whatever military surplus he managed to scrounge up, and was going on his way there to try and join the International Legion. And the kid could not have had any military experience beforehand. He was way too young to have to do that. And then I kind of just looked at him and said, "What the fuck are you doing here, kid? Like, seriously."
Mm-hmm.
So going back to the Ukrainian volunteering side of things, there is a volunteer network within Ukraine that is to some extent crowdfunding this war. For example, I spent some time with a Ukrainian volunteer unit that was formed in 2014 at the Maidan protests. And they've been doing their own thing since then, fighting in the Donbass and being crowdfunded by their hometown. And these guys are not paid by the government. They get tasked by the MOD, but they're not paid by the government. They don't get government supplied weapons. They pretty much are on their own, just doing their own thing.
Which, like, coming from like special operations, that's probably the best possible outcome you can have. I have none of the bureaucracy and only my area of influence. Like, to be very clear, there's something to be jealous of right there. Something to be like, man, it's kind of like living the dream. Although that's me sitting in a leather chair on the other side of the country where no one's blowing up my house. So, grain of salt.
I did not see any PT belts being worn.
Thank goodness. I mean, that's such an American bullshit. Oh, wear your reflective belts. Yeah, So yeah, there were there were for a while there were stories circling around going back to an information war. For a while there were these stories that were starting to circle, and I think this was like April of last year, around the March-April time, so like right after the invasion of last year, where volunteers were going over to join the Ukrainian Legion or the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. And they would this is what they would say. They would say that they were going over there to join the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, and when they got there, the Ukrainians took all of their useful gear and then kicked them back and made them leave or something. They were mistreated or mishandled, and I found a lot of these stories awkwardly scripted and oftentimes fit more into the category of you're trying to make excuses for why you didn't do the thing that you should have done or you said you were going to do, which can be a bit of an accusation. It's not. I understand that it's not something to be throwing lightly at people, but there were plenty of people who were telling stories that sounded a lot more like justifications for not doing the thing that they went there to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually interviewed a couple of guys from the Legion, and one of them pretty much said that he encountered a few dudes hanging around in Warsaw Airport going, nobody here to greet us. Okay, let's go home.
Yep. Or I heard the broken FAL story probably about 20 times. I don't know if the broken FAL is the reason. This is one of those stories that I heard enough times that it sounded a little scripted. Now I'm sure it could have happened to somebody, but it was like, you'd always get this guy, he's a little beleaguered, and he's like, you don't want to join the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. They're bad people. This is me paraphrasing him. So I went there, I got my ticket, I flew over, and when I met with them, it was just a man with a sign that just said, painted in sloppy letters, Ukrainian Foreign Legion. And so they put us on a train or a bus or whatever, and we went over to Kyiv. And they took my body armor because I came over with like a helmet and body armor. They took my body armor. They took my helmet. They almost took my boots, but I was able to keep those. That one was an oddly consistent point. And then they said they gave me an old FAL that broke after 2 shots, and it was always after 2. Kind of weird. And so like But I escaped, like, and I'm the only one who survived from this group of people, and I escaped, and I made my way out west, and now I'm here to tell my story. And it's like, what? Like the challenge would be like, there's a certain amount of skepticism that has to be placed into it, but the issue that I was running into at that point in time was that I kept hearing that same story over and over and over again. The people that I encountered in the airports were usually trying to get a lot of attention, and it was very obvious. But
yeah, and there's, I think there's just enough of a kernel of truth there to make it plausible, because the Legion not particularly well equipped.
No.
And they say they're pretty much the lowest on the totem pole when it comes to getting decent amounts of gear.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain criticism to be leveled at. And this certainly wasn't the common belief, but you would occasionally encounter people who are of this persuasion who thought they're going to go over to Ukraine because they know how to use an AK-47 or whatever, and they're going to get over there, be welcomed as heroes, be given quad tube nods, and go fight the Russians at this Ukrainian Special Operations Group. And it was like, I think Ukraine, the first month of Ukraine was a really big gut check for a lot of veterans who suddenly realized that they knew literally nothing about insurgency conflict except for being on the big boy side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I can see that, and then the shocking revelation that you're actually being infantry in an artillery war.
Yeah, right. Jeez, that's terrifying. I mean, it's still like, yeah, not everyone is the main character of Behind Enemy Lines or Enemy at the Gate. Sorry, so it's kind of terrifying. So then, what were for as far as like skill set development and like what are some when it comes to intelligence and being an intel conflict, right? Well, what are some? Do you have any like takeaways or things that you were reminded of or learned about maybe OPSEC or information based conflict?
Yeah, particularly like on a personal level. We were the guys I went in with. We were kind of really cognizant of PERSEC and OPSEC, just because if you get three Americans pinging off a cell tower on US phones with American IP addresses, then BM-21s are going to be headed your way.
Probably. So PERSEC and OPSEC, describe those for those who are unfamiliar with those terms.
Okay, so operational security, OPSEC, you don't want to compromise whatever is going on around you, because that's a really good way to burn bridges with the local hosts. And as far as your PERSEC goes, you're on personal security. First of all, trying to avoid attention from hostile intelligence agencies is a good thing. So we took steps. It's mainly electronic, and also, but the other thing as well is, when you're going anywhere in public, then you try and stay as low key as possible and dress like the locals. And when you're not, surrounded by guys with guns. And so digital security was a big thing when we were over there. As soon as you leave the airport, actually before you land in Poland, you're going to expect that maybe there's somebody around there snooping for American IP addresses. So your phone's off when you land, doesn't go back on until you swap in a local SIM card, be that on the Polish side or the Ukrainian side, and we did both. And then run a VPN, use Signal for your main source of comms, both within the group and outside. And the other thing we had was a little Solus hockey puck, which would use a local IP address and then ping off of the cell tower, whichever was the local cell tower. Didn't really matter what carrier was, but then if you use Wi-Fi to connect to that, then there's only one local IP address rather than three that's pinging towers. So you try and reduce the number of people who are visible electronically.
Okay, so this form of, yeah, because we did. I'm familiar with it. We did something similar where you'd have like kind of not only a pace plan for how we communicated with each other on different layers, like the guys, if you're working with somebody, how do we get a hold of each other, or like having different ways of communicating with people who might be back home, or those kind of descriptions. So and the other one being your cell phone is a very easily targetable item, and I remember learning about this when I was in Ranger Battalion, about how how easy it is to find somebody if you know any information on their phone, and I mean easy as in like, oh no, they're here, and there's no. If I have the information that I need, I know the phone that you keep in your pocket, I know its number, then I can find you, right?
Yep.
Kind of thing. And so that is a whole new level of, I would say, not survival or preparedness, but of conflict. That the average, I think the average American is unfamiliar with, of signal based locations and also like identity protection, I guess. Did you guys use like Faraday bags and stuff like that? You all had Faraday bags?
We all had Faraday bags, yeah.
Those-
And whenever there was a congregation of more than maybe a dozen people, then all the phones went off.
Yeah. No, when you say off, like you would double check, right? So you'd turn the phone off, throw it in a Faraday bag, and then meet. Yeah, that strong point. Did you ever make it to Kyiv?
Yeah. Going to pass through Kyiv, spend a couple of nights there, and then pushed on.
Okay, so for those like myself, whose only experience in war before Ukraine was getting on a helicopter, going somewhere, getting back on a helicopter, coming back, these night raids and special operations side, or for those who are interested in what it looks like on the ground, what does the Ukrainian conflict look like right now?
For the vast majority of the population, life goes on as normal. Your day is punctuated by missile warning sirens, because as soon as an aircraft lifts off in Belarus, potential target that could be carrying a missile, then the first alarm goes off, and then the Ukrainian people carry around an app on their phones which shows which area the country is about to be targeted. Or best case scenario, your phone goes off. There's a warning goes off on your phone. You pick it up, open the app, and then it goes, "Oh yeah, no, we're not getting hit now." So
how does that not like? how does that not like, dude? Then you're just have the Russians downloaded on their phone, and they're like, "Oh, okay, they don't think we're hitting on this building. Hit that building." Like, just figure out all the red areas and like avoid those, and then target all the green areas. It's like, right?
It's by state.
Okay.
So a particular state will have an alarm or blast.
Yep.
So yeah, for the greater part of it, I didn't see any food shortages. Didn't see any shortages really of any other consumer goods, with the exception of tires. We had the misfortune of blowing a couple of tires there, so getting those replaced was kind of a pain. You'll see a lot of military-age males rolling around with AKs in otherwise civilian-looking vehicles, mainly four-banger diesel pickup trucks and SUVs with foreign plates on them, because those kind of vehicles are used extensively in the East, and they're kind of regarded as disposable items.
Like your Toyotas and your I got to get me a Hilux. I got to get me a Hilux.
Don't look for one in Europe, because they've all been bought up.
Oh, it doesn't matter where. They're just, the Hilux is just such a. It's like one of those things that I know that it's just the thing. Like I would just want a Hilux to say I have one. It would almost be like a weird inverted status symbol. Like, I don't want to like church it up or lie about it. It'd be fun to have a Hilux just to say, yeah, I have a Hilux. Like, but I am not in such position, and I do not own one. We should get that solved. It's like everybody's dream to not everyone's dream, but everyone's dream to take a Hilux and put an RPK on top and be like, yes. And Americans like, wow, this cost me like $300,000, and then like somebody in East Africa is like, I didn't have to buy this, or West Africa or wherever the conflict is. But yeah, cool. So then is there something to do with this conflict in Ukraine? Or I have two more main big questions for you, but one of them I want to stick on. What are lessons that American gun culture you'd want to pass on to American gun culture that we have learned or are learning from Ukraine?
For American gun culture, well, as soon as it looked like it was all going to kick off, then surprise, surprise, everybody wanted a gun.
Sure.
Yeah, Ukraine had a licensing system in place before that, and it has become less stringent since the conflict. And whereas previously it was really hard to get a handgun, now they're also looking at, in the next couple of months or so, kind of removing those restrictions. So there's big opportunity over there for American handgun manufacturers.
Ooh, that's a really good point. Who do you think is going to jump on it first? That's a bad question. I shouldn't have asked that one. That one was such a dirty question. Now I should take a shower. So very quickly, do you have some examples of what those restrictions are starting to look like? I mean, are they moving towards something like constitutional carry?
No, there's never going to be anything like that. It's still going to be state controlled, and whereas it was previously, it was one of the more liberal regimes in terms of firearms ownership beforehand. I think, despite the fact, there's still, you go through police background checks and you need a license and all that good happy horse shit. I think this has opened a lot of people's eyes to the idea of the possibility. I mean, certainly some of the politicians I talked to when I was over there were kind of looking at the American system and going, Second Amendment's not a bad idea.
Mm-mm. No, it's definitely not. What are things do you have any tools or systems you use when it comes to evaluating information regarding conflicts in Ukraine? Like rubrics or a heuristic, or you generally avoid conversation on this level. You generally seek effort here.
I'd say just consider the source and compare the information you get to previous information that's been proven to be true. Mm-hmm. As far as trusted sources go, I think, again, there's been a fair amount of open source intelligence out there that has proven to be reasonably accurate. For example, Oryx on Twitter. There's been a pretty good way of calculating losses of armored vehicles that way.
How do you spell that?
ORYX.
Okay.
Yeah. And they've only been logging visually confirmed incidents of armor being destroyed. So you've got to extrapolate from that as to what the true number might be. But you know that it's not going to be less than that.
Okay. The idea, mechanized units is like mechanized armor is terrifying in my experience, because I don't have any experience with it. The only time I've ever used anything mechanized and armored was when I was the one using it. And what is the environment like that over there?
Right now, running armor is going to be a complete pain in the dick, just because it's so muddy. Once conditions start firming up, then I would be surprised if a counteroffensive didn't take place in May and June.
A counteroffensive coming from Ukraine towards
Yeah, because whereas everybody's focus right now is on Bakhmut and maybe a little bit further north Advika, you also got to figure out, okay, what isn't being talked about. And what isn't being talked about is the number of troops that are being trained outside of Ukraine at the moment, be it in the UK, be it in the US, be it in Germany, be it in Poland. And at the moment, that the conflict in Bakhmut serves to fix the Russian troops in that area and attrit them, and while at the same time preserving as much of the Ukrainian forces as possible. So I think if you look at the timeline and you look at what's happening with regards to training and you look at what's not being said, then I think that's May, June is probably going to be when it all kicks off again.
So I've been dealing with this perspective that sort of comes and goes, and it's trying to understand the world that we live in a little bit better. And
good luck with that.
I know, right? And that's why I have you on the show, so you can help me think betterly good. My point being said is how we the role of metaphysics is to establish a worldview. How do we think about the world? How do we think about the operations of the world? How does it work? Why is the world thus regular? Why does this function this way? It's oftentimes confused, and this is probably one of my biggest gripes as engaging in anything when it comes to philosophy, is that people love to use our words but not actually know what they mean. So like when someone says, well, logically speaking, you're like, shut the fuck up, you have no idea what you're talking about. It's only logical that no, don't use words you don't know what they mean. Thank you. So what I'm trying to say here is that one worldview that I occasionally, I would say, struggle with, and I don't mean struggle with as in like it causes me emotional angst, but it's like it seems both very convincing and impossible, is that the world is in a separation. It's a little bit fanciful. It's a little bit fantasy-like, in that the population of the world is a separation between the actors and the passive people. And the actors are all the people who have the information and know what's going on, and they're playing the game. They're playing the real game in the world, and everybody else is just kind of here for the ride. And this kind of worldview is described in myth. It's described in stories, oftentimes in fiction. It also has a very real, grounded element in it, like in politics, where governments will use clandestine forces, or individuals will engage in spycraft. And there is this idea that there's this world that we see on the surface, and then there's this underworld beneath it. And that underworld is where all the real actors work. And then, things that kind of draw out this idea are things like, we currently culturally value in the West, the idea of being in the know. If you know what you're talking about, we put a certain weight on that. So if that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, he's a fool. Let him go. We don't care. And so, this is where the idea that you could call somebody dumb or a fool, and it would be considered an insult. And there's so much more to it. I'm trying to wrap it all up into this little assessment. And sometimes the issue that when it comes to Ukraine is that you see very clear-cut examples of people who do and do not belong there. People who do and do not belong as part of the conversation. And that is one level that can easily be observed on one level of analysis, and that is kind of not quite the pundit level, but the how do I say it? Everyone wants to have an opinion about it, but their opinion about it isn't that important. And so we're making judgments of each other based on our opinions of a thing that's rather abstract in many ways. There's a difference between having an opinion about Ukraine and having influence over it. A difference between having an opinion about Putin being a bad person and bringing humanitarian aid to Ukraine. There's a difference between, supporting a starving child in Africa and actually like building an environment for them to not be starving. And so this also applies to, this is back to my experience of being in special operations, is that you have a very different perspective being on the inside of the veil than on the outside. And because of that, and this is where I know that I'm taking time to build the question, but I'm curious as to what you have to say about who are the real actors in this war? Who are the real people making decisions? Is there an element of grand strategy on the American side, or are we hopelessly lost at the behest of foolish and corrupted government officials who are engaging in war for their own profit? Or how would you even suggest navigating that?
Oh my God. So yes, I think there is an aspect of grand strategy to it.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly some policy goals that we're pursuing in the West, in the US in particular. Is there also an aspect of corruption and self-interest and all the other negative character traits that you'd associate with it? Yeah, 100%. I'm not about to say that the current administration in either the US or in Ukraine are, paragons of virtue. They absolutely are not. And some of the members of the intelligence community that I've spoken to who have worked over in Ukraine are particularly concerned about levels of corruption in government, particularly at the top levels. So I'm certainly not going to hold my hand up and say, yeah, I know exactly what's going on in there, but I know people who know people. That said, does that mean that we should not support Ukrainian people just because their government isn't particularly moral or upstanding? I'd say yes, there's a moral case for us to support people whose homeland has been invaded by an aggressor. And to what extent you want to do that, well, I think that's a personal choice.
Yeah, okay.
I'm going back.
You're going back?
Yeah.
You want to go in June? So
yeah.
I mean, I guess I'll have to check. I'll have to see what's going on at that point in time. Maybe we'll make a world tour of it. It doesn't sound like a bad idea, honestly. So yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to travel again, bring a camera this time, or I did last time, but not have a. I want to see a little bit more. So this. I feel like I'm hitting a wall in this one, and because there's still the grand strategy question is a difficult one, and I find it really unsettling. I appreciate your describing it in that there are issues on multiple levels of analysis, whether it's on the government or on this idea of bad actors and so forth. I do appreciate that, because I think this is a really good example of. I think the Ukrainian war has been a really good example for me as seeing the major differences between the choices of individual actors versus nation states. And so much so as to say, I can condemn the warmonger, but still support the conflict. I think
that's a reasonable way to put it.
It's not supporting the conflict. It's not
supporting conflict. It's supporting, I guess, our support of people who are defending their homeland.
Okay. So what is so you brought up, this will probably be, there'll be this one and maybe one more question just to close it all out is so in many ways the criticism that's being presented is being presented against people who are skeptical of our involvement in Ukraine. And I like part of the challenge that I have with this is that where the United States were going to be involved. Like, I don't think we're going to be able to accomplish an isolationist approach, but we're certainly not being very forthright about how much influence we have on the world. And some of that leads to then being not only abuses of power, but a lack of responsibility, right? And as America is one of the superpowers in the world, our population oftentimes exhibits a sort of flippancy towards that ability. Like, we don't really value it. We just sort of take it for granted. So in you brought some criticism against the right-wing zeitgeist. Is there a words of warning that you would recommend to somebody who is on the other side? Not just
Yeah,
right and left, but like
yeah, I would say the words of warning is that the bright line for me would be deploying American troops to either right up to the Polish border, or deploying American troops over into the border in Ukraine. I mean, if you pre-position troops and then telegraphing their location in order to provoke an attack, then I think that's one thing. And then, but I think it would be extremely foolish for us to get involved with putting American troops in harm's way. This conflict can be resolved by the Ukrainian people themselves, so long as they have the tools to do it. And right now, we're spending less than 10% of our military budget in order to do that. And I think there's a certain element of cooking the books there as well, because Pentagon accounting, and we're sending over M113s that were obsolete in the 80s, and I'm sure somebody is ascribing a great value to those. Anyway, I digress. I think there's certainly no point in us getting involved with troops on the ground. I think the Ukrainians can solve this problem themselves. I think in order to prevent it spilling over the borders and into a NATO country, in which case Article 5 would have to be invoked, in which case we would have to get involved, then in order to prevent that, send them the gear. Have them take care of it.
Send them some gear, which are made by American companies who manufacture goods that they also sell to the American population, which you for some reason don't want them to have. Yeah, well, that's not you, but you get the point, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm in favor. I think everybody should have a machine gun.
Yes, but which one? I'm going to make a judgment of you based on your
PK.
An RPK, the people's
PKM.
gun? PKM, yeah, PKM,
Yep.
The people's machine gun.
Yep.
I mean, has anyone 3D printed a PKM yet?
Good question.
Wait,
I think we should throw that up in the audience.
Should throw that up to the who came out? So somebody came out with an RPK this year. I can't remember who it was. I thought I heard about it at SHOT Show. Who's making an American RPK?
Not sure.
I thought I heard about it. I just don't remember. I got to find out now, because it's not because I have a particular soft spot for Soviet era or Soviet designed firearms. It's just it's an RPK. I mean,
yeah. I'm a belt that guy. I mean, get a PKM or go home.
Your little oven tray, the giant top. I have used a PKM in the past, just a long time ago. But no, that being said, the closing thoughts then, let's conclude this in. It's been Ukraine has been a difficult one, and I still think of it, when I think of it right now, is I think that Ukraine is showing the weakness of states and the strength of individuals. People are capable of buying a plane ticket, flying to Ukraine to fight against an invading force for a country who they do not know. And there are risks that people are taking on. Some of those risks are being taken on nobly, and some of them for very opposite reasons, for sure. And
some of them are being taken on because people are making informed decisions. And whereas I see a lot of the opposite as well.
Yes. Well, the opposite. I think my honest opinion is the people who are making informed decisions usually don't notice what's going on. They usually kind of go by. They're too busy doing what they're doing for you to notice what's going on, or they're directly in line with something that you're working towards. So it's like, more of a business partner relationship. But yeah, we're a year into this conflict. When I say we, I think the entire world is watching. This is very different than what we're used to. There's so much to be learning from it too, as far as tactics and equipment and strategies and capabilities. So I don't know. Any closing thoughts on Ukraine and its application to the United States?
As you said, there's an awful lot to be learned from it, be it on the geopolitical level or even down to individual skills and just the level of application of otherwise commonly seen household objects, such as the weaponization of consumer drones. I think as American gun-owning public needs to take notice of that.
Could you elaborate a little bit, or is that, or is that coming out in the next? Is that coming out in the next?
You might see some interesting photos of what people have been making from plumbing supplies and 3D printed parts.
I've been seeing there's a number of people on different social media platforms that are sharing drone manufactured or drone like consumer level drone tools, and I'm more than a little interested. It's just I have a feeling like I don't have a good environment to test it yet. I need to make some phone calls.
You live in Arizona. There's a lot of open space out here.
There's a lot of open space, but you know what? Sound travels. Sound travels a quite a ways, and I got to make sure I'm not too worried about it. But it's just, how am I going to do this? I've only been in Arizona for like a couple of months, so you cannot say that I am fully embedded in the population yet. I still look like a pale Midwestern kid, so like most of my neighbors. So we're good there. Cool. Well, I look forward to that. You said in the closing of the last episode, you said that you have an article coming out in the next edition of RECOIL that is focused more on the population, less on the politics.
Yeah.
When is that coming out?
That should be hitting the shelves in about a month.
Okay, so early to mid-April.
Mm-hmm.
Early. I know we talked about it last time you were on, but I wanted to get that out again because I'm looking forward to it. Yeah. All right. Well, then, if that has been the case, you have anything you want to shout out before we call it a day here?
Just the charity that I was helping out, and they supplied the crowdsourced the aid that I took in, the humanitarian aid. So it is people helping people across borders, and their website is letmehelpua.com. And if anybody wants to make a donation, I'll go deliver it for you.
Alrighty. And that's help. Let me help. What's the address again?
Let me help UA, as in international country code for Ukraine. Abbreviation, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Alrighty. Well, if that's been, let's close it at that. Thank you very much for having maybe a little bit more reasonable conversation about Ukraine. I know we all have our opinions, but I've been looking forward to having this talk with you about it because of trying to look at perspectives. Unless I will admit there was a small chance that I was expecting you to come out and go full imperialist, like we are the great, like this war has been fought since the 1400s. We're going to finally be the biggest empire because empires always exist. But we just got to Iain, Lord of the Universe.
Sorry, my ego got in the way.
Yeah, well, it happens. It happens to the best of us. Thank you very much for coming on the show again, having this conversation about Ukraine, presenting some ideas, something we're thinking about. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast with my guest, Iain Harrison, who is the lead editor and the editor in charge of RECOIL magazine. With that being the case, let's see. This one is supposed to go live. This would be next week. So this would be episode 68 of the Redacted Culture Cast, airing live right before season 1, Operation 2. So we will see you later, and we'll see you soon. Take care.